Meanwhile, the world of soccer was rocked by the news that Grant Wahl passed away yesterday whilst watching the Argentina game. A lot of reaction, as you would expect, across the globe on social media. Bob Lee tweeting out, "Generous of spirit, a peerless journalist. Grant Wahl did more to inform and explain and celebrate the beautiful game than any other American ever. Full stop. His loss is incalculable to our profession. Prayers for his family." Jeff Carlisle, of course, writer on ESPN, saying devastated to hear the news of Grant Wahl's passing. Just returned from Qatar a few hours ago and I'm catching up to this. A fine journalist and human being who worked tirelessly to support the sport of soccer as well as the work of other journalists who covered the game. Ian Dark tweeting, "Have just woken in Doha to hear the shocking news that Grant Wahl has passed. The game in America was lucky to be served by such a brilliant journalist, and in my time covering the US men's and women's teams, a kind and helpful companion. I can't quite believe this. R.I.P. Grant." On behalf of myself and the national team, tweets Tyler Adams, "We offer our deepest sympathy to Grant's wife, Celine Gounder, and all those who mourn the loss of Grant Wahl. As players, we have a tremendous amount of respect for the work of journalists, and Grant was a giant voice in soccer that has tragically fallen silent." Really nice tribute here. This is where Grant Wahl was supposed to be watching the game today. A wreath of flowers laid, and on the big screen, Grant Wahl paid tribute to ahead of the England clash against France. Well, Seb Herkengab knew him well. This is what they had to say about his untimely passing.
Thank you very much, Dan. As we saw there on social media, an outpouring of support in light of Grant Wahl's tragic passing. Of the three of us, I think you've known Grant the longest. What first comes to mind?
Well, I mean, I met Grant way back before the '98 World Cup in France. And, you know, you get this sort of lanky, already balding, even back then, kind of disarming, Midwestern charm type of guy who is super bright, but also super curious, and he wants to know. And he's kind of like, you know, sort of a gentleman in France, in Europe. And what struck me for so long back then was at the beginning when he started out, he was covering college basketball for Sports Illustrated as well as soccer. But soccer was his big passion. You know, there he is. He's writing a cover story about a 16-year-old LeBron James. But then he gets super excited because, oh, the magazine might send me to cover, you know, United States against Honduras or whatever. That really was his passion, and he devoted his life to it.
It's funny. He used the same word you did when we talked about it on Football Americas, disarming.
Yeah, he really was. And I like how you said he was curious. My first interactions with Grant were when I was coming up as a footballer in Los Angeles around 2005, and I think around the time I left Los Angeles and I went to Colorado, he just come out with the Beckham Experiment. You know, that book on David Beckham. And I still remember all the footballers involved. You don't get close to footballers. You don't get close to people like Bob Bradley, who he had a very good relationship with, Jesse Marsh, unless you're disarming. Footballers by nature aren't very trustworthy. They don't trust just
Trusting.
Trusting, thank you. They don't just trust anybody. He had that about him. And you know, there are little just things that I remember, how uniquely Grant he was. I was just talking to Seb, just popped up in my mind. Most people have like a pin collection. They collect jerseys.
Scarves.
Yeah. Ticket stubs, you know, when it comes to like soccer, football. Grant Wahl collected soccer shorts.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
Just so random, but so uniquely Grant.
You talk about uniquely Grant. I mean, what I think about it, and, you know, he tells stories. You know, Grant was an Eagle Scout. And
I didn't know that, but not a surprise at all.
No.
Yeah.
not a surprise at all. And he's explaining to my kids who are, you know, at that age when, like, Boy Scouts are not particularly cool. and his face still lights up when he talks about it. He talks about, you know, what it did for him. Or an even more extreme Grant example, but still very, very Grant. Grant has these two toy poodles, Coco and Zizou. And I didn't know this because they're getting older. As dogs or toy poodles get older, they can suffer teeth decay. And guess who brushes their teeth every night? There's a special dog toothbrush. And he tells you this in just the most disarming, endearing way. And you just say, and you listen, and you say, wow.
Can you put into context for people, because a lot of the people that see this may be international viewers, just how important he was to the American soccer media landscape? Because you know the American soccer media landscape, but I think you have a different perspective on it than us.
Yeah.
You kind of see it from the outside.
Look, I think it's tough to make your living as a football writer. As a football writer in the United States, all the more so. There are more today. But I remember when he became a full-time football writer, when SI said, okay, you don't need to do college basketball anymore. I believe at that time there were only two who were actually in the U.S., and Grant was one of them, who were making a living doing this. So he kind of had that whole continuum. He had that, you mentioned, that tremendous relationship with Bob Bradley. Bob Bradley, another Princeton guy, like Grant and like Jesse Marsh. They were all contemporaries there. But, you know, he was able to do it because he could always bring a fresh angle to the story. You know, he could cover a story from, like, the hardcore sort of futbolistas, start talking about tactics and technique and so on. But he could also say, hey, you know, sports fan at large, this is what makes a story relevant or interesting to you. And he always approached it with his curiosity, with his wonder. You know, he loved to travel, he loved to tell stories, and he was obviously a very, very gifted writer as well. And that's what made the package work.
He really was, and it's an easy phrase to say, but I don't think one to achieve, like the preeminent American soccer journalist, right? From a player's perspective, did you guys feel that way when you got a Grant Wahl interview, when he was tweeting about you?
Think about the names in the room. He was the name in the room.
Yeah.
He was it. I mean, you live abroad. We have a certain appreciation for the game and how it's consumed abroad. I go back into my upbringing. There are certain sports figures when it comes to media broadcasting, whether in print or in television, and you know who they are. Even today, when you speak to our colleagues, our international colleagues, they know Grant Wahl. And to think about how much he's accomplished, but how young he was, 48 years old, that to me is what's the crazy part about it. And you go back to how disarming he was. Grant spoke Spanish. Grant lived in Argentina. He did interviews and he did TV work and, you know, some writing in Spanish, and you would never think of these things. No. You got to meet some of the game's central figures and got those people to buy into what he was selling. It really is amazing.
And he was there. He was ever present, right? I mean, he was recognized here at the World Cup recently for the fact that he covered 8 World Cups, every World Cup since 1994. He covered the first one for the Miami Herald, of course, subsequent ones for Sports Illustrated and whatnot. You know, you don't get to do that. You develop a network of people, not just other colleagues and not just footballers, but coaches, league officials, and so on. And he knew how to do that side of it as well. You know, it was so multifaceted. He's not just the guy who wrote stories, the guy who did interviews. He's the guy who knew how to network, the guy who knew how to find the right angle. All those skills in one person.
Yep. Gab, thanks for the memories, the perspective at what I know must be a difficult time. You know Grant for a long time. We have much more on Grant Wahl and his legacy on the latest edition of Fútbol Américas, which is, of course, available now on ESPN+.